Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Idealized Science Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jacob Becky, and with me, as always, Dr. Brian Wargo. How you doing, Wargo?
Very good. How are you?
Good. I'm just getting settled here in Champaign, Illinois. I just started a postdoc about a month ago in the math department here. So, really enjoying it so far, and excited to join the community here. They have a big physics department, big math department, big electrical engineering. So it's really good for the quantum related research that I'm involved in. So it's been good. How's your year getting on teaching? Is this year 30?
This is, I think, 29 going on 30. So yeah, no, by the end of the year, this will officially be I will have completed 29. So we'll be at 30. Yeah.
Gotcha. How's it going so far?
Students, it's amazing how much they can learn quickly if you give them opportunities. And as long as you can give them the security that they need, that their grades are going to be okay if they just put in effort, most of them are going to be with you. And it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah. And as per usual, that's a good segue into the topics that we discuss on this podcast. And today is specifically about inquiry-based instruction, inquiry in the classroom, and explicit teaching of nature of science in the classroom. Basically this article asks the question, are these actually happening in the classroom? Reform documents have asked for changes along these lines for decades, most recently with the next generation science standards, but before that with inquiry and various other documents that came out of either AAAS or some other governmental agency and have made their way into state and local level education standards. And the study basically asked the question, are these actually happening in classrooms? And in this particular case, they were looking at 5th through 9th grade. But this is, as they point out, one in a growing body of literature that tries to give experimental evidence for anecdotal claims about these methods just not actually being enacted. So maybe it would be helpful for people who are new to the podcast or who just want some quick takeaways. We thought we'd try a structure where we just do a brief overview of the key points, and then we'll dive into our discussion about it. Because as always, after reading these articles, I have questions for you that I'm sure other listeners would find useful. So maybe to start, you could just hold up the article, read the title, and summarize a bit about what it says, and then we can go from there.
Inquiry-based instruction and teaching about nature of science. Are they happening? By Capps, Crawford, and this is looking like 2013.
2013.
Yeah, and you are referencing the science education standards from 1996, and I remember that's right when I was beginning teaching, and inquiry was all the rage, and it was a good thing. I remember thinking, well, this is exactly what we should be doing. So why don't we give...
now we fast forward, 25, 29, as we said in the intro, years later.
Yeah.
And at least at the time of this study, they open up by saying, anecdotal evidence suggests that science teachers are not engaging their students in inquiry and are not teaching directly about nature of science. And so this study aimed to provide more evidence-based documentation to support or refute this claim, essentially. It was asking the question. Their questions were, what was the nature of teachers' instruction? Okay. What were these teachers' views of inquiry and the nature of science? And what is the relationship between teacher views on inquiry and nature of science and their actual teaching practice? So we'll get into these things in details, but in great detail. But for people that just we talked to a high school teacher recently that said, this might be nice for my commute to work. So we were thinking, if people only have 15 minutes, 10 minutes even to listen, we want to give the punchlines right away so that if they're interested, they can listen to the rest or they can check out the paper themselves. But at least you have a takeaway. So the takeaways, as with lots of our articles, were a little bit sad. The findings indicate that the majority of these teachers held limited views of inquiry-based instruction in nature of science. And when those aspects were present in their classrooms, they were generally teacher initiated. So we'll talk later about student initiated versus teacher initiated and the different value in these various types of inquiry and discussion about nature of science. But they basically say there's little evidence of aspects of nature of science in teachers' instruction generally. Um, and this was a selected group. For this study, they had this group of highly motivated and highly skilled teachers. I think they said the mean, if I recall correctly, was 11 years of experience. Mostly all of them had their masters. The couple that didn't were working on them actively as they were involved in the study. These were people that were willing to dedicate time to an educational study, which indicates an interest in reform and these things. So they really did their best in this study, which is kind of counter to some other studies that we've reviewed, which try to be, unbiased in their selection criteria for surveys. Instead, they tried to actually bias to the people that were most likely to enact these reform-based pedagogies. And what they still found was that they are not doing it. So that is the takeaway. And the call to action in this paper that connects back to our mission at the Idealized Science Institute is that, you can't expect teachers to enact these things if they have never had research experience or, do not have a lot of experience with inquiry or nature of science themselves. If they don't have views that align with experts and that align with the reform documents, then how can you expect them to then, engage their students in these things? And so the actual, hope at the end of this study is that people would read this and take it as a call to action to start professional development or continue and improve professional development opportunities for in-service teachers along these lines. And that's exactly what we're trying to do at the Idealized Science Institute. And so we'll talk about all the things that we're trying to do to address these issues. But first, maybe I'll kick it back to you for your brief take on, and maybe it would be useful in this first 5-10 minute slot to just define inquiry, define nature of science, talk a bit about their similarities and differences and why they're two distinct terms, and then we'll maybe end there with a summary before jumping into our more in-depth conversation.
Well, if we want a definition of inquiry, let's just go right to the Science Education Standards from '96. They do a beautiful job. It says, scientific inquiry refers to the diverse ways that scientists study the natural world and propose explanations based on the evidence derived from their work. Inquiry also refers to the activities of students in which they develop knowledge and understanding of scientific ideas, as well as an understanding of how scientists study the natural world. It goes on and says, inquiry is multifaceted. The activity involves making observations, posing questions, examining books and other sources of information to see what is already known, planning investigations, reviewing what is already known in light of experimental evidence, using tools to gather, analyze, and interpret data, posing answers, explanations, and predictions, and communicating the results. Inquiry requires identification of assumptions, use of critical and logical thinking, and considerations of alternative explanations. So that's a lot, but essentially what scientists are doing and how they go about figuring things out in the world. That's inquiry.
Yep. And so nature of science is more about answering the question, what is science and what do scientists do, from more of a, I don't want to say meta perspective, but it's less about actually acting as scientists and more about understanding the process of science. And when we dive into this article in more depth, the nice thing is they have a couple tables that really carefully delineate both inquiry and nature of science, and I think provide a nice little rubric really for assessing whether or not teachers and students are engaging in these practices. And so, yeah, can you say a little bit about nature of science, how you did for inquiry, but also we were talking a bit before the podcast, and you were saying, there was kind of this trend of people really wanting to say that there was no relationship between these, or they're kind of distinct trains of thought that need to be targeted separately. And now it's sort of in this article coming back to, okay, they're obviously related, but they are somewhat distinct. So if you can talk a little bit about that, and what are the main takeaways if people are going to stop listening after this summary here? What is inquiry? What is nature of science? And maybe a bit about quick ways that you can engage your students in both of these.
So we already talked about inquiry is how scientists go about doing their work to figure things out, to make explanations. The nature of science, I would say, is more of like the philosophical underpinnings, the epistemology of what we're doing. In other words, why should we have confidence that these methodologies that we're using, why are they better than others? Why do we privilege these science ways of thinking more than others? So in order to understand nature of science, we're expecting that you understand that there's a difference between observation and inference, that you understand that facts, theories, laws are hierarchical, that there is no one scientific method, that science is empirically based. And there's a wonderful list. Whenever
Right.
I look at someone else's article, I always think of one of the originals. But let me just give you a few aspects of nature of science. I've already covered a few. That it's creative, and that almost everything we say is theory laden. And that's a term from Kuhn, but now is just accepted everywhere, that we come in with, we have biases of how we were taught and how we know. And we all know this. A geologist thinks different than a chemist and a physicist and a mathematician. All of our ideas are tentative in science, which means they can be overthrown very easily. Well, no, I shouldn't say very easily, but they can.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Nothing is permanent, and it's always subject. Yeah. Always subject to scrutiny.
Not easily,
And
but yeah.
one of the terms they use there, I wish I had it in front of me, but they say that they're it's something like appropriate skepticism, that all
Absolutely.
yeah, but I like the adjective, because I think what it said was science proceeds with either appropriate skepticism or some other adjective along those lines. But it's important to emphasize the appropriate there, or whatever the adjective was, because you can't just say, bring in skepticism that's completely baseless. And this is what we talk a lot about when you don't just want dialogue in the classroom, but you want scientific dialogue that's
Yep.
targeted at the actual, learning goals. And in the same way, the idea of nature of science, it really is, when you go to a conference, it's appropriate skepticism from an audience of experts, and this is what we're trying to stimulate in the classroom. And I guess so this is a bit about inquiry, a bit about nature of science, and if you can just comment a little bit on the overlap or differences between them, and then we can mention a few of the things that ISI is doing to help teachers engage their students in these.
Yes. So look, it's interesting because we thought for sure. I mean, it makes sense if you had students that are engaging as scientists might engage. Trying to figure out what kind of experiment would help you find the key piece to make an explanation or something. You would necessarily understand the nature of science, the underlying epistemology, and it was accepted that this is just common sense. If you can do inquiry, of course you're going to understand this. And that proved not to be true. And then the pendulum shifted way to the other side, where you wouldn't talk about these in the same sentence, right? I mean, it was really weird, because now you had to let everyone know that, look, these are separate things and they can't be in the same room at the same time. It's like they got a divorce or something like that. So I think it's interesting, knowing this history, that in 2013, they are tiptoeing back to this idea, and they say, look, there does seem to be an interaction between the two, which, come on, of course, right? Just because they aren't, explicitly going to lead into the other, of course there's going to be major overlap. And so it's funny reading this now that they are, just testing the waters. Are we okay to say dare I say, they even said, oh, there's a correlation between inquiry knowledge and nature of science. So it is kind of funny to see that. There are two others that are listed in the one of the original documents. Norm and Judith Lederman have spent their careers. Norman's no longer with us, but there's two others that were really important, and that is the social dimension of science and the social and cultural embeddedness of science. In other words, there are social aspects that affect how we are going to inquire, how we are going to know things, and that knowing up front is going to probably lead us in slightly different directions. So is that maybe a little history you were looking for?
Yeah, that's super helpful.
Yeah.
Given that I was born just 1 year after the standards document that you're referencing came out.
Oh, can I
This is
please
history that I am.
jump in with one other thing, because I know this was brand new in '96. So let me just
Sure.
read one other thing here, and this is one of my favorites. Thus, we come around again to the primary connection. I got to switch glasses. Sorry, I can't read this. Contention of the paper that science teaching has suffered because science has so frequently been presented just so much as ready-made knowledge, so much subject of fact and law rather than the effective method of inquiry into any subject matter. And as you might guess, this is John Dewey. This is 1910 in AAAS, talking about science as subject matter and as method. So this is 86 years
Yeah.
before. And then I just have to read his concluding paragraph in this. It's just wonderful, right? Actively to participate in the making of knowledge is the highest prerogative of man and the only warrant of his freedom. When our schools truly become laboratories of knowledge making, not mills fitted out with information hoppers, there will no longer be a need to discuss the place of science in education. So he's really talking about inquiry back here, and his notion was a little bit more about students' curiosity and how you should be using that, and students should be inquiring. But again, nothing new here. And
Right.
so
So that's 1910, and then
1910.
you're fast forwarding to 96, and then we're reading an article from 2013. And I think this is super helpful to mention because one of the things with all of the previous episodes of the podcast that I've been wary of is like, okay, well, maybe a bunch has changed because I'm not an expert like you are in the subfields. And I'm like, maybe a lot has changed since 2013. But I think if this is any indication that they were saying almost identical statements in 1910 as they are in 96 and in 2013, begging for teachers, really begging for the structure supporting teachers to enable them to enact these things. And finally, then a discussion about this would not be needed. So that's, I think, a great thank you for the historical context. I would like to have a brief pitch of what ISI is trying to do to help teachers along these lines, and then maybe we can jump into our more in-depth discussion.
Would this be
We
a good
just
time
uploaded.
to possibly show our Venn diagram?
Yeah, so we can definitely put the Venn diagram up on the screen, or you can go ahead and show it if you'd like. And then depending on how this comes across, yeah, we can also just upload it. But either way, we're showing here the Venn diagram of idealized science, where you have nature of science, you have practices, all here on the Venn diagram. And then we also have just recently uploaded to the webpage a list or sort of a graphic showing our offerings at ISI. On the x-axis, we have the teacher implementation effort, and on the y-axis, we have the expected learning gains for the students. And so there's a natural trade-off when trying to implement any of these things about how much effort it takes and what the expected gain is. And also, we should mention that the expected effort will vary depending on the teacher's background, so on and so forth. But when you're really trying to target inquiry, I think the gold standard, we would agree, are these long-term projects that we're encouraging teachers to guide their students through. They really need the term idealized, to be clear, is not saying sanitize or made to be perfect, but rather it's pointing out the fact that typically science proceeds in this very high division of labor state where an undergraduate might help a grad student who might help a postdoc who helps the PI complete a project. And everyone has a little piece of it, and they try and contribute meaningfully in their little way. And they definitely operate as scientists in those smaller domains, but they never get the chance to rarely get the chance to fully conceive of a project, also conceive of the protocol with which they would build an apparatus to test this, develop the data collection and interpretation procedure, and present that data to their peers for feedback and scrutiny. And so the Idealized and Idealized Science is encouraging teachers to help their students do just that. And this we call long terms at ISI, but it's just getting students to ask questions they are interested in answering and then helping them see them through. It doesn't have to be groundbreaking, but it has to be original to them. And, Wargo always says if you can Google it, there's no need to do it. Right? If there's an easy Google of what happens when I do such and such, and of course, this is becoming increasingly likely with the power of the internet. But there's still so many you wouldn't believe. I mean, as we see every year with students, you wouldn't believe how many great questions they come up with that, even when you're presented with them, you're like, okay, yeah, I don't actually know how this will. Sometimes maybe you do, but usually it's a great opportunity for inquiry. And so long terms really are the pinnacle of what we are encouraging and the science conference at high school. And maybe you could talk a little bit more though about how you target nature of science specifically in your classroom and what some teachers might be able to do. And they can learn more about the long terms on our website and through our videos. But maybe you could chat a little bit about how you incorporate explicit teaching of nature of science in your classrooms.
And that's really the word that needs to come out is explicit. I'm going to hold up the book right here because this helps you take your students through the training necessary and goes.
So this
right
is the Idealized. To be clear for those just listening, this is the Idealized Science book, a framework for practicing science authentically, that Dr. Wargo put together over the past how many years would you say? But either way, it was finished maybe 3 years. Yeah. Anyway, and this is available on Amazon. And if you don't want to buy it, but you would still like to read it, please just reach out and we'll get you a copy.
But the term that you used is, and this is based in the research that we found that, you must be explicit. If you have students doing much of the work as scientists, you would think that they would just naturally understand it. And maybe they have some conception of this, but they have no way of verbalizing it. So the key point is taking that time to be explicit about what you're talking about, and then engage them in the dialogue and target those features so they understand that you also are agreeing these are important aspects of understanding science. So I would say dialogue is going to be the key because you must be explicit with one another, sharing your ideas. So I think as you're naturally going through these, and this is the very best way to learn anyhow, and I think Dewey would agree with this, the students have a natural curiosity. Something comes up that they're working on their project or you're working on something together and they're like, but how do we know? Like, why is this idea not, worse than this idea? And then you really have to say, well, what is that other one based in? Well, this one is based in this kind of data. We maybe are using a correlational study versus something else. So asking those really good questions and then having real examples in front of them, I think that is key. And that's what long terms are going to do. They're just going to open up the world and force you to think about what am I doing and why am I doing it and why should I have confidence in this?
Totally. And also, this is not, say, an original offering or something of the Idealized Science Institute, but what you make all of your students do is read some of the great books about science and about the nature of science, history of science. And I think it's never a bad time to plug the support of this idea for all teachers to encourage their students. Well, first off, the teachers should try to read a bit of these books. And part of what we hope to do on the through the Idealized Science Institute is some book reviews on some of our favorites to get people started. And going through the actual nature of science, the history of science, this can help teachers develop an understanding of what is science and what do scientists do, and how do I contextualize it with history and the current state of the art, reform documents on what we think is possible in the classroom and stuff. So. And then I think it's worth mentioning that while long terms are maybe the highest effort for the teacher, it is really hard to guide even a few students through these, let alone a class of 50, let's say. But there are also things we offer online, like the quick quizzes, which can be great for encouraging dialogue, fostering dialogue in the classroom. And that can be a jumping off point for nature of science discussions when you have multiple students making claims. And they're using different models that they have. You can start to target these different aspects like the theory ladenness that you mentioned or the social construction and the social aspects of science. And just making it explicit as you are doing these things provides that context. And over time, as you see in your classroom, where you start every year asking your first year physics students to answer the question, what is science and what do scientists do? Mm-hmm. And then through this whole course, which can be viewed as an intervention on this topic to some degree, you then reassess at the end of the year. And I think you would agree that the growth made in that year is usually substantial. And it can even happen just in the first 9 weeks through the pendulum, which is outlined in the book. And we're making videos detailing how to use something as simple as a pendulum or simple as a pulley to really target these things. Anyway, I think we tried to be brief with our summary, but as always, you predicted this right before we started recording, but we always end up getting too excited about it and talking way too long. So maybe here we pause and just say, if anyone is listening and is short for time, the takeaways of this article are basically, as of 2013, and I'm sure there have been other articles since supporting this, even the best and brightest teachers and the most well-intentioned teachers struggle to implement inquiry and inquiry-based teaching and learning in the classroom, struggle to teach explicitly about nature science, in large part because they do not have an expert-like understanding of nature science themselves. And even when they think they're teaching inquiry, as the standards would suggest, it turns out there's actually a misalignment between their self-reported standard of teaching and what observations actually show alignment with those reform documents. So the ISI is trying to basically, this call to action in this paper really supports our mission, and we are trying to help teachers have continual access to teaching materials and new and inspiring ways of engaging their students in inquiry, in dialogue, and to teach about the nature of science. So if you take nothing else away, we encourage you to check out idealizedscience.org or our YouTube and connect with us on social media so that we can continue to provide resources along these lines. And please get in touch if you're interested in learning more or partnering with us in any way. Wargo, maybe now would be a great time for me to bug you with questions. And so one of the things that I'm very curious about as we jump into, more of a free-form discussion about this is the nature of science specifically. If a teacher is, so I view this as, the reform documents, I've seen a lot about how to encourage inquiry and actual practice of science. And the long terms, I think, address this really well. But I think that if I'm a teacher that hasn't taken a history and philosophy of science class, hasn't done their own original research or had those research experiences themselves, either in high school or college or beyond, I would find it very daunting and, if not impossible, to teach about the nature of science. Because from the outside looking in, it's very easy to think you understand, there's a scientific method and this is how it proceeds. But I only really feel like now, after a PhD and into a postdoc, do I start to feel like I have any real expertise in what it is scientists actually do. So how do how can a teacher starting out start to fill in these gaps and be able to actually teach about the nature of science?
I think one of the best ways is, I think our training, and let's just use the pendulum example. I think it's important that as students are collecting data, because they think this is what science is. Science is just collecting data. But remember, you can collect data on a whole bunch of things, and that doesn't make it science. So what is it about your collection? And then once you have that data, what do you do with it? And students will instantly always just take the average. They have no idea why they're taking the average. They just take it. Why? That's what they think they're supposed to do. They don't think through what does an average tell them. So by having those discussions, and then by you as a member of your classroom modeling the appropriate skepticism, all right, why do you have confidence in that average? Look, that's going to get to the fundamentals of, okay, what is it that we've done? What is an average? And is an average any good? And those discussions are so rich, and you got to make sure, I know teachers, this is one of their fatal flaws. I have to yell. I have a special ed teacher in my class, and she's wonderful, and they want they just so desperately want to give the kids what they need. You can't. You've got to let the students come to it. And in fact, we're always afraid of being wrong as students. you have to model being wrong as a teacher. You have to put claims out there and say, and you got to play this off, right? I think this, and give them something so they can end up saying, wait, that seems like that is not an accurate description of how we would go about doing something scientifically. And then you might even feign that you're offended, and then have them articulate what is it that they really think science is. Right or wrong, they now, just like our quick quizzes, you have them laid on the table. Now everyone is talking openly and honestly, but you got to make sure that your classroom is one where everyone feels safe, being able to discuss things. And you know that you've arrived when students will intentionally play devil's advocate. You know they clearly believe in something else, but for the greater good of the class, they will take an opposite stance and push it to see and to find out where is the weakness in the argument. I tell you, that's probably one of the most powerful, transformative, and it's got the most stick when students can come up with that. So it is, I would say, empirically working through things, having those discussions. And by the way, this also works for theoretical problems. Like, why is it that you're assuming that the Earth is a point mass, right? I mean, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Can you
absolutely.
justify that? So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, I think the practical advice for a young teacher would be to read a paper like this one,
Yes.
and see the table that they outline. Like
Yes.
you read from, I think it was table 2, talking about nature of science. They really highlight the things that they want to target in the classroom. And then as a teacher, when you're writing lesson plans or planning to use a quick quiz or whatever it might be, you can use these and target those things specifically, and make sure you take the time to explicitly note when a student is doing something that a scientist would do, and is in some way exhibiting the regular practices of a scientist, and talk about the nature of science in that moment. And I think it's just taking that small amount of time to really point those things out explicitly, I think is what they're saying. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but they say basically just having these experiences is not enough to actually change views of nature of science. Mm-hmm. So I was curious about this because what exactly is then enough? Is it just the explicit intervention that we're talking about, or what what is needed? Because that's a direct quote from the paper, is that the authentic science experiences are not enough to change either teacher or student views of nature of science, and they have a citation in there.
I mean, we're absolutely convinced that everyone picks things up implicitly. How do you learn general rules in any social system? We just pick them up. When you really analyze that, that's not true. Often there is something where you're confronted, and maybe it's an uncomfortable situation, and you say, oh, I think I just violated one of the norms. And so you might have a best friend, you might say, hey, this is what happened. They're like, well, this is why, right? So they do get that explicit nature. So it forces you to take what you think that you know, and then to actually articulate it. And again, like on our quick quizzes, there's a reason why we make you put your answers down. Just like in the paper by Capps and Crawford, teachers are absolutely confident that they're doing these things, but when they're videotaped, when their lesson plans are analyzed, they use multi-methods here to try and figure out. They're like, no, you really are lacking this understanding, and it's nowhere in your lesson planning. It's nowhere in your actual lessons, and it's hard for us to know that. Let me just point out one thing. I would say, you were saying, why not read a paper like this? Any one of these documents are fantastic. And let's say that you don't have time to read the whole thing. This is the Inquiry book that came out in 2000. Let's say you just skim it. You get to this table right here, and if you just take 10 minutes or 5 minutes on that table, and it'll just say there's 5 basic features of inquiry that we would like to see in a classroom. And then it tells you, is the teacher initiating this or is the student? That right there, I think, is quite, it can be transformative in itself. Just knowing like, oh, I never thought of this. I'm doing all of the work for the students instead of allowing them to come up with this.
Right.
And I think this is really important for teachers to understand. One of the best ways for them to gain understanding is through teaching, and that's why they get better at these things, right? Because they're putting in the work, they're thinking about how they're going to explain it. Let the students do this, I mean, it's like magic.
Right. Yeah. Now you point out, or you make a good point that the nice thing about these huge sort of documents coming from governmental agencies is they almost always have these really good
Oh
executive
yeah.
summaries that are maybe 10 to 20 pages, and everyone has time for 10 to 20 pages, maybe not for the 400 page detailed, document. But 10 or 20 pages, the executive summary is almost always really well written and just gets right at the essence of what the takeaways are. And then if you find a couple tables there that maybe could even serve as rubrics, I could see some of these things like in the Capps and Crawford article that we're discussing today, or in Inquiry or whatever it may be. There are these tables, and you could really start to use these as a rubric for your students, right? Along all these axes, uh, there's levels of granularity to this, of how you take one particular aspect of inquiry that a student might be reflecting in a response, and then there's levels to that as well. Is this fully student initiated? Like you said, one of the more expert things would be for a student to actually play devil's advocate in a meaningful way, to really try and tease out they know the correct answer, and then that not only do they know the correct answer, but they know enough of a preconception or misconception that they're able to target that with some questioning. That's an expert like behavior, and that should be rewarded
Yes.
in reflected in their grade, whatever their grade means. And so as a concrete suggestion to teachers, I would say that would be a really good starting point, is to familiarize
Yeah.
yourself with one of these tables that lists the inquiry as well as nature of science, what you look for in the classroom, and start trying to target that and encourage that. And it is a little bit uncomfortable when you're letting the students take the lead. I think for the first time, it's you don't know where it's going to go. You can't plan that part, but it gets easier with time. The benefit can be huge.
I would also say, as a teacher, why not grade yourself, right? Okay, we just went through this. All right, how did I do? And if you find yourself, you did everything, right? And then what I would use is I would use like two different color pens every time that the teacher did one of these versus when a student did it. And if you find out that the class is absolutely dominated by you doing everything, you really need to back off. Now, you don't have to back off completely and just let them absolutely run wild. You can, maybe set them up. Like it's sitting there. Hopefully someone's going to take that and then it's going to build. I mean, here's really what you want. You want to be able to leave your classroom and the students are still discussing as if you're not even there. It just,
Yep.
this culture where students realize that, oh, I'm supposed to ask confirmatory questions. I'm supposed to be appropriately skeptical whenever I'm talking about this, so that it pushes you to explicate your thoughts. So, absolutely.
Totally. Totally. Awesome. Well, there were a few quotes that I really liked, and maybe we can go through a few of them, talk a little bit about more about what we're trying to do with ISI, and hopefully helping teachers along these lines, and some exciting things we have coming up. But you read the excerpt from Dewey, 1910, and then at the end of this article, Capps and Crawford, they say, if these issues are not addressed, we fear that we will find ourselves in a similar place 10 years from now, where even the best teachers are not engaging their students in scientific practices or teaching about nature of science. And 10 years have passed, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I suspect if you were to do this study again today, you would find very much the same. And this is exactly why our organization exists. We're trying to be one of the groups that this article asks for, which is you can't just have a teacher graduate and start teaching and expect them to continuously improve if they don't have interventions for themselves. And so we need professional development, and we need teacher trainings that support teachers in their growth through their career. That some of these quotes were just so good. It's just, if we expect teachers to use new instructional approaches, then they need to have well-designed, ongoing opportunities to learn and teach in this way. Very obvious statement, and yet when you look at what teachers actually gain exposure to, it's often missing the mark here. With that, maybe if you want to just give some thoughts about how this article maybe stood the test of time in the past 10 years and its relevance today, and maybe some last thoughts for teachers out there.
Well, they're not going to use the words inquiry anymore, and they're not going to use nature of science. They're going to be talking about how are they enacting practices, right? And the next generation science practices. And you'll never guess what they're finding. We've got a new name for essentially the same ideas. We tweak them a little bit. We make sure that we're, fully aligned with the current ideas in science education. But as you can probably imagine, it's not translating very well. It's so difficult. And so I think, what we're trying so desperately to do at the Idealized Science Institute is say, look, we understand not everyone's going to go back for a graduate degree. And even if you do go back for a graduate degree, often you're spending so much time on other things that it's just not possible for you to gain enough for the classroom. So what we're trying to do is say, look, we have ready to use things that you can try the very next day in your classroom. And that's what we're encouraging. So look, if you're listening to this podcast, think about this. You're already part of this community that we're forming. And if you can get others to start speaking in this manner about, am I really engaging my students in inquiry, nature of science, the scientific practices, and so on, you're already going in the right direction. And then if you incorporate some of our quick quizzes, okay, I'm working on the dialogue part. I'm getting used to having students articulate ideas that are maybe not correct, but I'm able to let them articulate that without jumping in and having other students communicate with other students. Those are all steps in the right direction. So anything that you can do to make your practice a little bit better, I think year after year you'll get better. So don't be too stressed about it. I mean, look, you can read these articles and say, oh my gosh, the sky is falling.
There's so much I need to do. Yeah.
There's too much to do. No, just take one little piece. And every year, if you're like, I'm going to try to get my students to speak, not just any kind of speak, but speak in a way where they're challenging one another in a scientific sense, using the underlying theoretical models that we're using those the terminology that we're talking about, models and things of that nature, you're doing a good job. So just keep on working your way, and we're going to keep producing some of these podcasts. And by the way, you can always give us some feedback if there's something that you would like to hear us discuss. Maybe you have practical problems that you're not sure how to handle. Maybe we could offer something.
Yeah, we would love to get some feedback from teachers in the classroom, and we would be happy to address questions on the podcast. So if you have those, please, either leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube or send us an email, whatever it may be. We'd love to hear it. But yeah, I always appreciate that you remind teachers of this. I think it would be very overwhelming if you're just getting started and you see all these things and it's like, okay, well, I'm trying to stay afloat. I have 3 preps or whatever it might be, and I'm just trying to get through the day. I think that's really why a lot of this reform doesn't stick, is because, it's great to sit there and say this would be the ideal, but when you're subject to certain constraints, I just think it doesn't empathize with the typical teacher situation well enough. So what we're really trying to do is lower every barrier that we can to using these things. So we have recently started calling these longer form videos view and do. So we literally are asking you to view the video and then go do it, like exactly as it is presented. You've put 30 years of time into refining these, and the benefit or the reason we want to share it is, this could save people a bunch of time. It's not saying take this and then try and make it your own. It's saying literally take this and do it, and you will have improved your classroom in this way. If you keep doing that year after year, you look back 5-10 years later and you have a reformed classroom. So definitely don't get stressed if this is a bit overwhelming with how many things there are. We have that graphic that will hopefully guide teachers in picking things that are appropriate for their level of time. And I think it's worth mentioning that these are not at all, some of these things would require real freedom from the administration to be able to do what you want to do in the classroom. But it's worth noting that if you are forced to teach an AP or whatever it might be, some course with a very strict schedule and a test at the end, whether it be a state test or a college board test, that you can still implement these things in small ways, right? I know for a fact that on the AP mechanics exam, there's projectile motion problems, and we have projectile motion quick quizzes. So if you're gonna, instead of working an example on the board, why not engage your students in dialogue and have them actually start to think and act like scientists while working towards that goal of getting a 5 on the AP exam? So All of this is on our website at www.idealizedscience.org. You can connect with us on all of our social media. We have a link tree set up that will take you to all our social media. We encourage you to watch those videos. The PDFs for all the quick quizzes are uploaded always on the website. And we're going to continue making this podcast, and we'd love to hear from teachers. In the meantime, if they've used any of our resources, and we would love questions of any sort so that we can start to really help people at a broader scale. In the near future, we're hoping to have in-person teacher trainings, so we will be advertising things along those lines. And every year we have a science conference at the high school that allows students to present their original research. If you're in the Pittsburgh area, please get in touch. This is something we would love to have people from other districts participate in. But if you're listening to this somewhere else, not in southwestern Pennsylvania, which hopefully someday will be the more probable thing, then we are still encouraging people to do long-term research projects with their students. So the students, of course, will conceive and carry out with support from the teachers a research project of interest to them. And we'll have information on how to submit those on the website to be eligible for one of our Idealized Science Institute scholarships. So with that, Wargo, any last thoughts?
I do have one thought. If we're always targeting teachers and students, but if you're an administrator, if you're on a school board, if you're in a community that you support your school, understand that a lot of teachers, especially this is state by state, many teachers are barely getting by, and they do not have time to spend any more time on their lessons because they might have a second job.
Yep.
A lot of teachers have children. Understand that this takes some time, and often professional development is not terribly useful for teachers. Consider giving teachers time in your professional development days, or maybe get some days where you could pay teachers to go through some of these articles, some of the frameworks that have been mentioned here. I think that would be money well spent. So I would say if you can support your teachers financially, I think that also would be doing your part in helping making this change.
Absolutely. And as always, if this information is useful to you and you're able to support the podcast and the Idealized Science Institute, we're always accepting donations. And if not, it's also extremely useful to just share, like, comment, subscribe, all of the above, to try and get this in front of more teachers and students that would be motivated to use these resources. So thank you for listening, as always, and we look very forward to having you in the next episode of the Idealized Science podcast. So thanks, Dr. Wargo. I'll talk to you soon.
Nice talking to you.
Bye.